Oh, I got off easy. Believe me. He has many, many stories to tell. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Massimo. Thank you to the committee for having me. And thanks to all of you for the hospitality today. I've had a great visit. It's great being back here in Boulder. And we're going to go to the Serengeti shortly. But I have to take a moment, to let you know why it means so much for me to be here and acknowledge the role that CU Boulder played in launching me out into the world. I hesitate to share this next photograph for so many reasons. But there it is. And the kids here in the front row, you can say, find the nerd in the photo, and it's all of them, but okay. But this particular nerd, there was kind of a uniform. It involved beards and tennis shoes, right? And I don't think it's really changed, at all. But look, it was, as Mike was describing, it was an incredibly exciting time as sort of just getting peeks into sort of how patterns form, how an egg becomes an embryo and an adult, and that became a foundation for later work that my team did in trying to understand how some of that diversity evolves. So 40 years and more than 40 pounds ago. Okay. So one charge of this lecture is to address scientific topics of wide public interest. And now that you know a little bit of my scientific ancestry, I'm going to frame today's talk in a sort of provocative perspective offered by the late Jonas Salk, who said that our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors. And if you kind of give a little thought about this goes right to the kind of the purpose and meaning of our existence. Are we being good ancestors? What could we do to be better ancestors? And what kind of world will we 8 billion people leave to the tens of billions of people that will follow us? And the trend doesn't look so good. You see headlines like this. It essentially says, well, it goes back to 1970. It's kind of roughly saying that when I was here in Boulder, for every 3 wild animals on the planet, there's now 1 today. And when I saw a headline like this about the idea of putting a paved road right through the middle of the Serengeti, which is the site of the largest remaining great mammal migration on the planet, I get really worried. And I am an indoor biologist, microscopes and genes and embryos, that paid my mortgage for a long time. But it's the love for the animal kingdom that has always sustained me. And I was really worried by seeing things like this, just what kind of shape is the world in? And I thought I had to kind of get out of the lab and go out and see more of the world, sometimes with ecologists, sometimes, as you'll see, with other companions. And I really wanted to see it for myself and ask the question, are we doomed? Or is there time to change the road we're on, to be better ancestors? And if so, how? And so today I'm going to tell you the story of that journey. It begins in our original ancestral home in East Africa. And by the end, my goal is for all of you to go out of here with more hope than you came in with, okay? So we're going to go to the Serengeti. I'm going to start with a little history of the Serengeti that might interest you. First part of the 20th century, first half of the 20th century, not many people in the Serengeti, visiting the Serengeti. World was pretty preoccupied by 2 world wars. It was hard to get to. There were some really serious diseases to worry about. But after World War II, in the 1950s, some of the folks starting to go into the Serengeti were biologists. And when they encountered the spectacle of the Serengeti, they did what biologists do, which is they decided we better count things up, right? So the very first survey of what was in the Serengeti was undertaken by a father-son team of zoologists, German zoologists, Michael and Bernhard Jimmick. And I've got a clip from that coming up in a second. But my experience of the Serengeti starts with this group of people. I thought, okay, if the Serengeti's in tough shape, I want to go see it. And I'm about to commit like the greatest sin you can do in front of an audience with some friends, but mostly strangers, which is to show you pictures from a vacation. I thought, well, if I'm going to go see this place, I want to take my family because I don't know how much longer it's going to be there. So we loaded up. This is the very fancy eastern gate of the Serengeti. This is my family, 3 of my sons, my wife, my daughter-in-law. We got in the Toyota Land Cruiser, popped the top. We're really excited. This is late June. You can see the grass is a little bit brown, and we're going to start bouncing down this gravel road into the Serengeti. And I was a little worried. Things looked a little bit dry, but we're very excited. And we start looking left and right as we're heading down the road. But it's kind of hard to see things until somebody sort of shouts out, "Hey, what's that?" Okay, and there you go. There's a lioness in the Serengeti. But I'm a little worried because I'm thinking, this is kind of hard to spot this stuff. And I'm the only biologist in my family, and they're just going to leave me out here and go back to the lodge, So fortunately, we went a little further up the road. We started seeing little slivers of green, little shimmers maybe of a little bit of water kind of came up over a rise. And then everything. So there's a water hole here to the right, and stripes, and Mike can tell you, stripes have paid the mortgage for me. Little smaller stripes in this case. And then, the dawn patrol coming down. And from that moment on, the Serengeti offered up an unending canvas of animals of all sorts of sizes and shapes and colors, from, sturdy warthogs to lounging hippos and sleek impala, majestic giraffes. We stopped for every giraffe. Our guide got there was a lot of giraffe, okay. What can I say this is not like a calendar picture. This is a leopard. We had several hours with this leopard as she went up and down a tree, feasting on a kill and coming down for a drink. And as I looked across this landscape, I was absolutely awestruck. Nothing I had seen on television, nothing I had read spoiled the impact of the Serengeti on me. But as the days went by, I had this other sort of gnawing feeling, particularly if anybody in the vehicle asked a question, which was, if it was, "Hey, Dad, what's this?" or "Hey, Dad," I didn't know what the heck I was looking at, okay? I didn't understand anything. I didn't know why there were so many wildebeest and so few topi, a grazer of similar size. And that's, a wee bit embarrassing because I'm a biologist, and I've made a living studying the animal kingdom. Granted, at a different scale, but studying spots and stripes nonetheless, and little invisible fruit flies and their embryos and things like that. But what I did know is that in every cell in that fly's body and every cell in our bodies here and throughout our physiology, that everything that goes on in making and running animals is regulated. And so I thought about this a little bit, and that's really where a lot of molecular biology has been for the last 50 years, and that the way molecular biologists kind of have come to understand how life works, it's to know the rules of regulation. And if you'll allow me a little sporting analogy, the program has been really to identify key players, molecules that regulate a particular process, figure out the rules of how they govern their play, and then this is what we've been doing for about 50 years, but it sparked a revolution in medicine, because this is how we found out so much about immunology and reproduction and physiology, et cetera, et cetera. And it's totally changed what's available at your local pharmacist. So I wanted to understand, okay, if there are rules that govern life down at this scale, are there rules that govern when I'm looking on this incredibly large, majestic scale at the Serengeti? And how are the numbers of animals and plants regulated? Now, do these rules even exist, right? And if the answer was no, shortest lecture ever in this series, okay? But it turns out, after I got back from the Serengeti, I started looking into this and started interviewing some ecologists and things like. Turns out there are these rules. I'm going to dub them the Serengeti rules because they're all on display there. They weren't necessarily first discovered there. You could see them on display in other places. Could have called it the Lake Erie rules. Publisher said, not going to go with that. And the question is, just like we use the sort of molecular rules to understand medicine or to prescribe medicine, can we use these ecological rules to preserve or even cure ailing ecosystems, sort of planetary medicine? And that's where the hope comes in, okay? So this Serengeti history I wanted to tell you about 50 years ago is that just as I was awestruck, the Jimics were awestruck when they came into the Serengeti, and they conducted this first survey. And I'm showing you a clip from an Oscar-winning documentary from 1959, where there's Bernard Michael, and they're plotting their course across the Serengeti, and in their very handsome plane. And they're going to try to count all the animals that are visible from this plane across the Serengeti. They've got their clipboards. They got a couple extra spotters, so there's 4 of them in the plane. And You'll see this is graphics circa 1959, all right, Hollywood graphics. And this is their plan to go back and forth across the Serengeti and count animals, okay? So here we go. You can count along with them. Get ready. 3, 2, 1. Here we go. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yeah. So that was the strategy at the time, which was what they call flying it low and slow, but there's nothing really slow at 100 miles an hour. And I'm sure the students in the room are thinking, how accurate could that count really be? And they did this over a period of like 12 days. And if you think about it a little bit, when they went back the next day, I'm not really sure the animals all stayed in the same place. Nonetheless, they made a grand count, the first count ever in the Serengeti in January 1958. And they counted, some might say with Teutonic precision, 99,481 wildebeest, 57,199 zebra, 5,000 topi, 1,800 buffalo, just 60 elephants. So that was still the echo of the ivory trade. The elephant populations were just starting to recover in the Serengeti. Altogether, 367,000 mammals that were large enough to count from a moving plane, all right? And they wrote a book, and they made this film. And in the book, they worried aloud. They wondered, was there really enough plains, mountains, river valleys, and bush areas to maintain the last giant herds still in existence? Well, it turns out in the next decade or so, an answer was forthcoming to their question, and it wasn't the answer they expected or feared. And it started to unfold when a 21-year-old undergraduate from Oxford landed in the Serengeti in 1965 named Tony Sinclair. Now, he followed a professor down there to study birds, which is why they immediately had him counting buffalo, which is how undergraduate projects work, right? Everybody knows. But Tony, he relished it. He relished the opportunity of being in the Serengeti that summer, and they put him on the census of animals in the Serengeti, and something popped out. It turns out things were changing in the Serengeti. And it showed up in his buffalo census, where he counted more than twice as many buffalo as had been counted just 4 years earlier. And this seemed really remarkable because, anywhere you went in the world, you didn't expect the numbers of a large mammal to be increasing, right? That wasn't the direction it seemed like most things were going, but it seemed like there were more buffalo. So by the end of the summer, Tony was absolutely enchanted with the Serengeti, and he was determined to go back for his PhD work and study in the Serengeti. And the other scientists who were around said, well, Tony, could a birdman study buffalo? And he said, I'll study anything. And that's how Tony became a world's expert on buffalo. And over the next about dozen years, Tony asked really 3 questions. This is an anesthetized buffalo, I should point out. I know we all see pictures out of Yellowstone where tourists don't quite get the idea, but yeah, not safe to approach. He wanted to ask, first of all, and he built his thesis around this question, why were the buffalo increasing? He really wanted to understand what was the great differences in the number of different kinds of animals in the Serengeti. So many wildebeest, so few topi, et cetera. Those numbers that I was reciting to you earlier. And really in his heart, he wanted to understand, why is the Serengeti the way it is? Okay, so 3 questions. So for his thesis work, he continued to study the buffalo, and the first thing he did was continue the survey and see whether or not that trend was holding that he first detected in 1965. And yeah, the buffalo kept increasing, okay? So this is you're a great audience already, but this is the audience participation part, okay? And we got some ringers down here who know a lot, okay? So I'm going to open this only to undergrads or high school students who are here, all right? I want you to just come up with some hypotheses for why the buffalo were increasing, okay? Now, don't overthink this. This is what science is about. You're just trying to come up with some possible explanations. Why might the buffalo be increasing, okay? Just shoot your hand up, I'll call on you. Come on, there you go. Okay, you know too much. Okay, you can give him the extra credit, okay? Is he yours? Okay. Most of the audience didn't hear that. He just jumped to the Jeopardy double round where where all the values are much higher. Let's start with a simpler hypothesis, but well played, you paid attention in class. And that was last semester, is that right?
Well, he's a sophomore. He had me as a freshman last year.
All right, okay. Well, you're gonna get your due in a second. What's your name? Evan, gotcha. Okay, we're gonna get back to Evan in a minute because Evan's done his homework. Anyone who's not done their homework and doesn't know sort of one of the ultimate answers here, because it's kind of a showstopper, Evan, but I appreciate it. Okay? Yeah.
Downregulation of competition from other herbivores.
Okay, less competition from other herbivores. Good hypotheses. Anybody else? Now that I've given Evan some trouble, go ahead, fire away. Smaller, so you think, but that might be a counting thing, right? So, maybe they were on a bigger area and they've been concentrated in. Okay, yep. Little geography thing. Yep. Less hunting. Yep. Less pressure from humans. You're all right there. There's a couple. Just you probably skipped over one or two that occurred to you. And you're like, no, I'm not going to raise my hand and say that, but you'll get credit from me if you do. Why more buffalo? Think simple. Is there another hand up? There you go.
Controlling various diseases that were brought in by Carroll, possibly.
Okay, we're thinking about diseases. Very sophisticated audience. This is, hold that thought. You and Evan can sit together now. Okay, yeah.
I saw the documentary.
You saw the documentary. I know as well. But I heard somebody, did you say more food? More food. Okay, that's the answer. This is like, what's that? Was that game show where the families try to solve the puzzle and try to come up with the audience answers? Okay, no, you're all doing great. You're all doing great. But more food, you kind of skip past that. More buffalo, you might think more food. Maybe times are better in the Serengeti and there'd be more buffalo, right? And somebody brought up human hunting, but there's probably something else that popped in your head. You just didn't want to say it out loud. But Tony had to analyze these things systematically. In the back right. Fewer predators. Okay, there we go. All right. Now, I scratched out more food, and I shouldn't have done that. We'll stay with more predators. Okay. Got a little ahead of myself. Got a little rattled by the IQ in this room. Okay. So those were the first two hypotheses Tony thought about, which was more food. That would support a larger buffalo population. Turns out there were a bunch of other scientists in the Serengeti who were monitoring the amount of food that's available. Do you know what buffalo eat? Grass, exactly. So you could quantify the amount of forage available in the Serengeti, and it looked like over that decade, pretty much it was stable. So that's the no more food. But as you mentioned, more predators, right? Well, fewer predators, sorry. What Tony did is he actually looked at cause of death from buffalo. Now, there's not many things that can take down a good-sized buffalo, usually only a pride of lions, okay? And it turns out he was studying cause of death, and there was not a lot of predation. Furthermore, there were other scientists in the Serengeti looking at, for example, lion numbers, and lion numbers were actually increasing. So predators were actually going up. And that leaves the difficult one that has already been answered. So if you didn't hear those answers, if it's not more food and it's not fewer predators, what else might control life and death of the buffalo? And as we heard, disease. And specifically, Tony knew that there was a notorious disease in the Serengeti that struck every few years, horrifying, called cattle plague or rinderpest. And you see an outbreak. It hit every few years. It came into East Africa around 1889. It hit domestic cattle, and it hit wild buffalo and wildebeest regularly. And it was thought that wildlife were the reservoir for the virus. But Tony knew right around 1960 there was a new rinderpest vaccine that was being deployed in the Serengeti area to vaccinate the cattle of the pastoral people around the Serengeti. And he thought, gosh, maybe there's some connection here between the vaccination program and the boom going on in buffalo. And he thought, all right, what could that be? So he thought, well, maybe there's less virus out on the Serengeti because of the vaccination program. And he thought, well, how could I look at that? He says, well, he knows that just as in you and I, in a wild animal, when they get exposed to a virus, they make antibodies, and you can detect those antibodies in their serum. And so he thought, I'll look at buffalo of different ages, and I'll see whether there's any interesting trend in terms of exposure to the virus as revealed by antibodies. And it turns out it's his first eureka moment, because he sees that no buffalo born after 1964 have been exposed to the rinderpest virus. So he's thinking, wow, this may be it. The buffalo are booming because this virus has not been hitting the Serengeti. Now, like any good scientist, he has to think, I need a little more evidence to see whether I'm on the right track. So we thought about the other animal that it hits, and that other animal, wild animal it hits is wildebeest, right. So he joins the wildebeest census and starts seeing what's going on with wildebeest numbers in parallel to the buffalo. Whoa, exactly what Tony thought. Now remember, the Jimicks were really worried that the Serengeti might not be able to support 367,000 mammals. Okay, so now the wildebeest have hit 1.4 million. So Tony did the same experiment in the wildebeest, surveyed their blood for antibodies to the rinderpest, saw a really similar correlation. No wildebeest born after 1963 had exposure to the virus. So that meant that vaccination of the domestic cattle had provided this knock-on benefit where the buffalo and the wildebeest weren't getting infected. So it's actually the cattle were the reservoir, and that vaccination program protected the wild animals. So Tony now thinks he's really understanding why is this boom happening right before his eyes, the Serengeti, more mammals than anyone had seen in the 20th century. Well, other biologists, other scientists studying the Serengeti were noticing some other changes taking place in the Serengeti. And I'm going to mention 3 of them, and then we're going to see whether or not we can connect the dots, okay? So one of the annual occurrences in Serengeti is wildfire. And scientists who were monitoring the wildfires realized that the fires were smaller and less intense. They were taking less area of the park. And you can see relative to 1962 and 72, a lot less burn, and the burns were a lot less intense. All right, so that's one observation. Other biologists studying other species noticed that the giraffe were having a little boom. And who doesn't like more giraffe? Except for guides taking me around the Serengeti. Okay. Third observation. Well, Tony, who hoped to stay in the Serengeti a long time, the wisdom at the time was that with the elephants coming back to the Serengeti, that they were going to knock all the trees down in the open plain, and then Serengeti would just become a grassy plain. So he thought, I'm going to monitor the trees in the Serengeti to watch the impact of the elephants. And so these are Tony's actual photographs, so forgive the fact that he took the first one on a cloudy day and it's hard to make out what's going on in the foreground. But these are photographs over 30 years, and later it's kind of showing you what's going on in smaller form here in 1980 with smaller trees and saplings. But over the course of this time, the trees didn't disappear from the plain. A whole acacia forest grew up, okay? Absolutely opposite to what they thought. All right, so can we piece this all together? Fire away.
With less fires, the fires were meant to mow down a lot of the vegetation in these areas. So with less fires, the trees were able to take root and able to grow much more intensely than previously.
Beautiful. Why more giraffes?
More trees.
Bingo. Here we go. Beautifully done. Are you in any course for credit at the moment? You are. Okay. See me afterwards. I'll write you a note. Okay. So the rinderpest eradication, that's hitting, of course, the grazers. The grazers graze on? Right. So more grazers, you have less and shorter grass. They mow it down to about 10 centimeters versus the tall grass you had while the rinderpest was raging. And, of course, that less and shorter grass gives you less fuel for fires. And, of course, what would fire otherwise do to young trees, right? So with less fire, more trees, more giraffes feeding on the trees. But even more than that, more cover for the carnivores, more nesting sites for birds. And that shorter grass turns out to be better habitat for things like butterflies and other sorts of insects. So what scientists are noticing is just more on the Serengeti, okay? So contrary to, I think, most documentaries you might see on East Africa, if you ask folks what they think makes the Serengeti the way it is, they're thinking, well, you've seen, lions chase antelope or whatever it might be, right? But if you ask Tony Sinclair what makes the Serengeti the way it is, it's a million lawnmowers, right? It's that simple, mundane action of so many grazers just sculpting that landscape for a lot of the other wildlife, right? And of course, for the tree regime and all that. So that brings us to our first Serengeti rule. And there's 4 of them, so you can count down how close you are to the reception real soon. And this is coined by Bob Payne, who steals a line from George Orwell. But so some animals are more equal than others, and they're dubbed keystone species by ecologists. There are some species that have an outsized effect on the diversity and abundance of the ecosystems in which they live. And the wildebeest, as they make their 600-mile circuit around the Serengeti, they have this disproportionate effect on the abundance and diversity of what's in the Serengeti. Now, and this is true, just as there's key molecules in a lot of the pathways in our body, there are key species out there in ecosystems. Now, Bob Payne also had invented a term to describe that sort of domino-like effect that we were just describing going on throughout the Serengeti. This is Bob Payne. This is the original keystone species in his hand, which is a starfish from the rocky intertidal zone of the Pacific Northwest. That starfish, acting as a predator, plays an important role in maintaining the diversity of those tide pools. And he came up with this idea, thinking about the keystone in a Roman arch, which is if removed, the arch collapses. Same thing he showed experimentally, if you remove this keystone, diversity of the community collapses. The late, great Bob Payne. Well, Bob also had a description for that domino-like effect, as I was saying, of this interactions. I mean, who would have thunk that wildebeest were somehow influencing, that if you had more wildebeest, you'd have more giraffes, right? You got to kind of think, what sort of connections, what kind of dots do you have to connect for that to come through? And Bob referred to these very strong but indirect effects operating through food chains as a trophic cascade, trophic referring to feeding. So that this greater number of grazers and the influence on the fire regime and the influence on more trees was having a strong indirect effect on giraffes. And it's our second Serengeti rule. You're halfway home. So some species have these strong indirect effects on other species through trophic cascades. What an incredible discovery, right? Go out there and looking at nature and you realize that there are these really strong but hidden interactions until they're revealed by some sort of perturbation. Okay, so the wildebeest are very important. What in turn regulates the wildebeest? You might be thinking, well, I was yakking on. 1.4 million wildebeest, what the heck are you going to do with that many animals? And have they kept growing? Is all of East Africa buried in wildebeest? Okay. Nope, that 1.4 million was the peak. The wildebeest leveled off, the population leveled off at about 1 million, and it's just been oscillating around about 1 million since that peak in the late 1970s. So what Tony wanted to understand, Tony and some of his collaborators want to understand was, okay, well, what the wildebeest are so important to the Serengeti, what regulates the wildebeest? And you can imagine it's a sort of a simple, a couple simple possibilities. The wildebeest, they could be regulated by predators, right, eating the wildebeest, or they could be regulated by the amount of food that's available. And before I get to the answer, I want to talk a little bit about what Tony and his collaborators learned about the regulation of animal numbers in the Serengeti in general. Now, there's a shorthand ecologists use for this regulation to describe predator regulation as top-down, from the top side of the food chain, or regulated by food from the bottom up. And Tony and his collaborators asked this for a bunch of animals in the Serengeti, and it led to one of my favorite graphs in the scientific literature, which I'm going to make you look at. Okay. So what Tony and Justin Brashears, now at Berkeley, and Simon Mduma, who works in the Serengeti, did was over several decades, when they came upon a carcass, they tried to identify the cause of death. And they could tell predation. They could at least distinguish that from starvation or disease. So they wanted to know what fraction of death was caused by predation on the Serengeti. And that's plotted for these various animals along the y-axis here. And they plot it against the animal body size, okay? Favorite graph, and here's why. Look, let's start way up here in the upper left-hand corner. Oribi, which weigh in at about max maybe 20 kilograms, okay? Look at the rate of predation, okay? There's about 10 animals, including large raptors and large snakes, that can take down an oribi, in addition to the cats and other sorts of things. All right? So lots of potential predators out there for oribi, and they're largely victims of predation. Kind of a tough chat for mom and dad to have before Oribi Jr. goes out into the world, right? If someday, your supper, okay? And you can see for impala and topi, kind of a similar situation. But now let's slide all the way here to the right. Take a look at something like an elephant. Essentially negligible predation. It might occasionally happen to a baby elephant, but really not at all. And what you can see in this relation to body size is that these are really two different lifestyles you can see on the Serengeti. These animals generally they reproduce quickly, they reach sexual maturity quickly. This is sort of the James Dean live fast, die young lifestyle, okay? These animals, however, long-lived, long time till they reach sexual maturity. This is the Marlon Brando all-you-can-eat lifestyle, okay? Because they're so big, they're too big to be taken down by the large predators of the Serengeti. So it's two different strategies, right? Either get big, right? Or reproduce quickly and replace yourself. And the get big strategy is really interesting because this requires a lot of resources, right? A lot of food, a lot of water to grow elephants and hippos and rhinoceri, et cetera. So, of course, these populations are going to be generally smaller in terms of numbers, whereas these can be, of course, pretty big herds. And then there's stuff that's sort of in the middle, like zebra and buffalo, and I haven't told you anything about wildebeest yet. But I just think it's fantastic because I was totally stumped when I first went there. How do you even do science on the Serengeti? Well, I had to read some monographs and learn. I mean, you can't do an experiment like this, right? All you can do is collect field data for a long period of time and make some sense out of it. And I think they made a lot of sense out of it. Okay, so what's up with the wildebeest? They're food regulated, okay? So this took decades to figure out that the abundance of food, which is influenced by rainfall, most especially in the Serengeti, influences the number of wildebeest. And you think, well, how would that work? And it's based upon their density. It's a per capita type of regulation. So when you think about the wildebeest population, when it was small due to rinderpest, and that pressure was relieved by the vaccine, they were at low density and they showed really high growth rate, really overshooting sort of their 1 million or so equilibrium, got to high numbers, and they've kind of walked slowly back down. They sort of oscillate around this. So growth is high when the food per capita is plentiful. And Serengeti experiences a dry season and a fire season. And Tony, some years, saw 30% of the wildebeest population die off at the end of the dry season. So food does become limiting in the dry season. So it declines, when food is limiting. And when you have that many animals grazing in the Serengeti, eventually they use up the good forage, right? And this operates sort of like feedback in the system. A little bit the way your thermostat works, but of course there's a lot of molecular regulation in our bodies that works this way. It's how we keep things in a certain range, is that we boost production when it gets low and we damp things down. We boost production when it gets low and we damp things down when it gets abundant. So this is density-dependent regulation. It wasn't discovered in the Serengeti, it was discovered elsewhere, but lots and lots of animal populations are regulated this way, which brings us already to our third Serengeti rule. So close, you can even taste freedom. So the regulation of some species, it depends upon their density. So, you can immediately appreciate why this rule is so important is because it explains exactly the behavior of the buffalo and the wildebeest when that pressure was taken off them. And so it's going to come into play in a little bit later, what I have to say. But why did I tell you all of these rules and about buffalo and wildebeest and all that? It's because every place is a Serengeti. Everywhere that you have this simple structure of a food chain like this, producers at the bottom, think of plants and terrestrial communities, grazers eating those plants, and carnivores coming along and eating those grazers. You set up the possibility for keystone species, for trophic cascades, for density-dependent regulation. And ecologists have discovered these phenomena at work in virtually every ecosystem you can think about. You think about a freshwater pond or a tropical forest or a coastal seagrass system, et cetera. You see these phenomena play. You can see this in your backyard on a rose bush with, aphids and creatures like that. So if every place is a Serengeti, then that means that if we can figure out who the important players are, maybe we can repair some of the damage that's been done. So by the same analogy I gave you to molecular biology and medicine, we need to know the rules of regulation in these ecosystems. We need to know the key players, the species that regulate community structure. We need to figure out the rules that govern their play. And we need to think about how to replace what is missing, or at least fix the broken links in this ecosystem. And so I'm going to close with two examples. One that might be somewhat, or perhaps very familiar to here in the West. One perhaps less so. So let me start in what's a place that's often dubbed the American Serengeti, Yellowstone National Park. If no one in this room knows this tree species, your citizenship is revoked, okay? All right. So what was going on with the aspen in Yellowstone? You may not know about the problems with aspen in Yellowstone. And biologists figured out that they were essentially senescent. They were really the only aspen by the 1970s or so were really old, okay? And you're just missing what you'd expect to see all these younger aspen that should have been growing up in Yellowstone. So what's going on with these where are the missing aspen and why? And what's the culprit? What could be the cause? Well, I'm going to give you a really obvious hint. This is one of the biologists who studied this phenomenon, William Ripple from Oregon State University, standing in a grove with a very tall stick, and you can look at the trees behind him, and you probably all know what's going on there, right? So this is the elk have been hammering. These are obviously large aspen, but you can see the elk have been browsing these aspen pretty heavily. So why would there be excessive elk browsing? Why would these aspen being stunted? And you might think, well, if elk browse on aspen, maybe there's something not controlling those elk. And on a 3, 2, 1 countdown, you can all shout out what that might be. 3, 2, 1. All right, you all get extra credit, right? So, and you know, I know it's April, and some of you need it. Okay, so, all right. So, wolves. Now, it turns out this issue of the elk hammering the aspen and the disappearance of wolves correlates with, in fact, the extermination of the wolves. The last wolf in Yellowstone exterminated in 1924. And you start seeing the aspen are getting senescent after that. So the thought was every other mammal that we know from the fossil record that's been in Yellowstone over the last several 100,000 years is still in Yellowstone. But by the 1990s, and for the previous 70 years, except for the wolf, okay? So biologists thought, maybe we should bring wolves back to Yellowstone. Now, think about that. Of course, there's a big public outcry because of concerns over what wolves could do to livestock and things like that. But also from the biologist's point of view, there's a lot of uncertainty because Yellowstone's been running for 70 years without wolves. So can you really introduce a large carnivore back into a system like this and really expect to see any kind of change? Well, they were reintroduced in 1995. This is one of the first wolves coming from a Canadian gray wolf pack up north. They get a little time to acclimate in Yellowstone in an enclosure before they're released. And biologists have been studying what's happened ever since. It's a fairly complicated story, so the pros in the audience, give me a little bit of slack, okay? It's a patchy picture, but I'm going to show you some of the snippets of that patchy picture. First is there's no doubt that wolves established themselves in Yellowstone, and their populations have fluctuated ever since this started. And you know the wolves are reproducing, and they're leaving the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. You may know that wolves are spreading across a lot of the American West. No doubt elk numbers are going down. That's partly due to wolf predation, partly due to some other complicated factors of where the elk are going and how they're getting hunted, and the bears are having something to say about this. But nonetheless, we're down to probably fewer than a third as many elk as when the wolf reintroduction started. And so you're seeing a lot less activity from elk on things like aspen browsing, seeing less browsing, seeing aspen height increase. So within the first 10 or 15 years of this experiment, there were things that were definitely measurable. Again, depends on where you were in the park. It's patchy. It's not a huge number of wolves. There's other changes taking place in Yellowstone that are independent of this. But when you look in certain places, if you look at, for example, areas where willows grow, this is an area called Black-tailed Deer Creek. And if you just look in the foreground here, you look at the change in willow height across this creek, it's pretty abundant. Some of you may know that willow is the favorite food and building material of, amen. Paul, you got him, you know. This is A+, A+, et cetera. I don't even see why they have to take an exam this year, you know? Okay. I'm talking to Paul Strode of Fairview High School, one of our nation's great biology educators. So, oh, sorry. Beavers. Sorry. So I'm having a little conversation here with the kids because they're acing this whole thing. Okay. Beavers, right. So here now, beavers back in Yellowstone and doing well, and more beaver colonies. And beavers in turn have a huge impact because once beavers get to building various things, they create these wetlands. These wetlands harbor all sorts of species. So again, a knock-on effect on biodiversity. So reintroduce the wolves, into a little indirect chain of things, more beavers, providing habitat for other sorts of creatures. And that brings us to Serengeti rule number 4. And that's the most important thing I have to say today. And that is that nature is resilient. That given a chance, and that maybe habitat, protection, time, the combination, populations can rebound dramatically, right? You certainly see that in the Serengeti. We see that to a degree in the Yellowstone reintroduction. But we've been seeing this for more than a century from protecting individual species. Let me just give you a little sample of stories some of you might know from headlines over the years. Northern elephant seal, knocked down to perhaps as few as 20 individuals, now a population of 200,000. Sea otters almost exterminated around the whole Pacific Rim, now back more than 100-fold. You can see it, northern Pacific humpback whales, 12 or 15-fold recovery there. Bald eagle, famous story due to DDT, bald eagles and peregrine falcons. We were down to fewer than 500 breeding pairs of bald eagles by 1967. There's over 70,000 breeding pairs of bald eagles now. And the population's much larger than that. I'm just talking about breeding pairs. And of course, the gray wolf, absent from Yellowstone. That's the 0. And then the numbers, one of the last numbers I saw was somewhere around 1,700 in the greater area. So given a chance, these individual species can come back, right? That may be protection, et cetera. But what happens when more than just the wolves are missing, or more than just what's happening to otters or humpback whales or whatever? What happens when lots and lots of things are missing? Well, that doesn't stop extraordinary people from trying, and that brings me to my last story, which kind of paints that fourth Serengeti rule in the brightest colors. I'm going to take you to southeastern Africa, to Mozambique. This was kind of the next stop on my personal journey. I went on because I started to hear and then meet some of the people involved in the project I'm about to describe to you. So Gorongosa National Park is in about the geographic center of Mozambique. Mozambique, very large country, twice the area of California. Long coastline along the Indian Ocean. And it was a destination for jet setters. Here's a film clip from the 1960s. And you could see tourists going in, and you can still see these cars in Boulder, I know. Yeah, right? Right. North end of Boulder more, right? Right? I guess, as I recall. Anyway, and you can see that these lions are so well fed, they're just goofing off in front of the wildebeest, okay? Unfortunately, though, after Mozambique's independence from Portugal in 1975, civil war broke out, raged for 20 years. Killed 1 million people, displaced 5 million people. And Gorongosa was essentially the geographic center of the war. It was the rebel stronghold. Here's footage from the war. And you can see in some of this footage, you'll catch a glimpse of the park buildings. So yeah, 20 years of civil war. So after peace was declared, some biologists who had worked in Gorongosa before the war went back to Gorongosa, and this is what they found. They found the buildings bombed out. They found the vehicles all shot to pieces. But then they looked for wildlife, and they had to look really hard. So the numbers in the bright blue bars are from before the war. The numbers in orange are after the war. Okay, so that's bringing you down from 14,000 buffalo down to maybe 150 or so, 2,500 elephant down to a couple hundred. So 97 to 99% elimination of these large mammals, and they couldn't find a lion. That was the symbol of Gorongosa, was a lion. They couldn't find a lion. Okay, so that perhaps is where the story would still be today if it weren't for some remarkable people and a meeting between two of these remarkable people. You may recognize the person on the right, the great Nelson Mandela. The person on the left is Greg Carr, an American philanthropist who was really interested in both human development and conservation. And in a meeting with Nelson Mandela urged him to, for example, work, if he was going to work in Mozambique, to try to develop parks for the people. Parks where human development was as important as conservation, where the parks would be an economic engine for example, for people in the surrounding communities. And so with that inspiration, Greg formed a partnership with the Mozambican government in 2004 to try to restore Gorongosa National Park. And that was obviously a very heavy lifting. He was told, forget about it. Greg was sleeping in the backs of vehicles in those early days, contracted malaria 3 times. That was almost the end of the story for Greg. But anyway, only about 11 years later, I was able to visit the park, go around with Greg. And then I've been following the scientific story ever since, because what Greg did, a brilliant idea, was that he invited the world scientific community into Gorongosa and basically said, help me with this restoration, but also monitor how it's going. And so he built science facilities in Gorongosa, in the middle of Mozambique, one of the poorest countries in the world, and invited the scientific community to come in. And they've been studying and working in Gorongosa ever since. So in 2000, before the project started, if you looked at all those orange bars from after the war, there was maybe 2,000 or so large mammals of all types combined. By 2018, there was 100,000, okay? And that's essentially Serengeti rule number 3 in action, which is that density-dependent regulation. The habitat was there. It just had been emptied of most of the mammals, and that the mammals that remained were the seed stock of a rebound. And when the pressure came off, which meant no more poaching, no more trapping, no more shooting them for food, they started to rebound. Greg didn't have to do very many reintroductions at all. He actually sort of toyed a little bit, brought in a couple hundred buffalo, a few zebra, et cetera, but he realized that was going to be very expensive, very slow, and pretty stressful to the animals. But as they started monitoring the animal populations, they realized that Mother Nature was going to do the work, and these populations started coming roaring back. Now, what about the lions? I showed you 0 lions. Well, it turns out Gorongosa is open to surrounding sort of wilderness and unpopulated areas. And they noticed lions started strolling in. And when the lions saw those rebounding herbivore populations, they thought, I think I'll stay, okay? And so in 2015, when I visited, there were about 60 lions in Gorongosa, monitored very carefully, a lot of them collared, et cetera. I was able to go back to Gorongosa a couple years ago. The number of lions was close to 200. Here's a couple of them. One of them wearing a collar. Sorry, my shaky camera work from a moving vehicle, or maybe even from a stationary vehicle, as the case may be. All right, so the lions are making it, but the biologists knew there were other large predators that used to be in Gorongosa, and with the herbivore population doing well, they thought, okay, we can now chance bringing some other things back. And one of the really attractive species to bring back is a predator that hunts by a totally different style, different kinds of prey, but also a predator that's endangered in Africa. It used to be abundant, has now disappeared from most of its range, and that's the painted wolf or wild dog. So these were introduced from a couple different packs in South Africa in 2018. They took a liking to the menu instantly. They've done really, really well, so well that in fact now Gorongosa is able to export wild dogs to other wilderness areas in Mozambique. So now Gorongosa, which is not just well protected because of rangers, et cetera, but really embraced by the community, is a stronghold for wild dogs in southern Africa. Now, I've told you about the wildlife because it sort of gets to the Serengeti, but if Greg was here, he wouldn't be talking about the wildlife at all. He'd be talking about the people of Gorongosa. And the story is about much more than the animals. And I'm just going to tell you one element of this, but in addition to schools and healthcare and girls' clubs and all that, Greg realized that 20-year civil war meant no one got trained in Mozambique. There's just a whole missing professional class in Mozambique, so they were really short on scientists, for example. And he thought, well, I've got all these scientists coming here from around the world. Why don't we start a graduate program for Mozambican students? And Sean seems to like Mozambique, and he has access to Howard Hughes' money. So, don't give me any more credit than that, than just saying yes to Greg. But so in 2015, I am proud to say that HHMI decided to back the development of this graduate program, which is a master's in conservation biology. I think it's the only one in the world that takes place entirely in a national park. It's a 2-year program, exclusively for Mozambican students. And just a few weeks ago, they sent me a picture of the 4th graduating class. So these students, and I've met a very good number of them, they're going on to positions in ministries in Mozambique. These are the best trained scientists in Mozambique. They're going on to positions in ministries. They're taking leadership positions in other wilderness areas. They're going back to academia to do science, et cetera. This is the next leadership class, really, in Mozambique. And I'm sure somewhere in there are going to be, statespersons and future presidents, et cetera, of Mozambique. And so it was more than anything, it was visiting Gorongosa that restored my hope. What happened in such a short period of time in one of the most difficult parts of the world to operate from such a low baseline is really remarkable. And to be embraced, the 250,000 people that live around Gorongosa really cherish this park as theirs. So Greg's done it. And so there is hope, not just for wildlife and for Gorongosa and for Mozambique, but for lots of places across the world, if we try to be better ancestors. And hopefully, creatures and places like this will be around for generations to come. Thank you very much.